Now live to Simon Marks, our Washington bureau chief. And Simon, quite a lot of developments in the last hour or so, including confirmation from the authorities in the US that Nicolas Maduro is now being held in New York.
Yes, absolutely, Andrew. And that press conference that the Prime Minister referenced that Donald Trump will be giving at around 4 o'clock UK time has an awful lot riding on it for the American president, particularly in terms of his relationship, not just with the Prime Minister, but with other leaders across Europe and around the world, because there is general consternation at the moment that this action on its face by the United States appears to be absolutely illegal, completely lacking in justification under international law. But I think we are going to hear a rationale for it coming from President Trump and from some of his top lieutenants in the hours ahead. Now, we know that President Nicolas Maduro is going to face trial in New York on a host of charges that were delineated by the Attorney General Pam Bondi in a posting on social media. She says that Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, have been indicted in the Southern District of New York. Maduro has been charged with narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices against the United States. She goes on to say they will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts. And she says that on behalf of the entire US Department of Justice, she wants to thank President Trump for having the courage to demand accountability on behalf of the American people. Now, President Trump himself, in the only comments that I think he's yet made to reporters, gave a brief telephone interview to a correspondent from the New York Times at around 4:30 in the morning, Florida time, saying that he was celebrating the success of what was described as a mission to capture the Venezuelan president. A lot of good planning and a lot of great troops and great people were involved, he said, and he described it as a brilliant operation. When he was asked by the New York Times if he had sought authority from Congress for the operation or what is next for Venezuela, the President of the United States said that he would address all of those issues when he speaks to the American people at around 11 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. That's 4 in the afternoon UK time. Separately, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who is close to President Trump and a Make America Great Again Republican in the US Senate, says that he has had a conversation with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and he took to X to say that the Secretary of State informed me that Nicolas Maduro has been arrested by US personnel to stand trial on criminal charges in the United States, and that the kinetic action we saw tonight was deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant. This action likely falls within the president's inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect US personnel from an actual or imminent attack. And Senator Lee goes on to say that the Secretary of State told him that he anticipates no further action in Venezuela now that Maduro is in US custody. So what we learn from all of that is, first of all, that it appears that a new indictment has been laid against President Maduro, now former President Maduro, and his wife, who was not previously charged by the United States. And it looks like this new indictment is going to supersede the indictment that first alleged Nicolas Maduro is a drug trafficking kingpin when it was laid down in the Southern District of New York 5 years ago. Secondly, from that conversation between Senator Lee and Secretary of State Rubio, it sounds as though they are preparing to say this was not an attack by a sovereign nation on another sovereign nation. This was not an act of war. This was a limited military operation to protect American military personnel who went into Venezuela to effect an arrest warrant, the arrest warrant being the one relating to those criminal charges that Nicolas Maduro now faces, along with his wife, in New York. Further, all of the talk of regime change has moved slightly onto the back burner, given that the Secretary of State is telling Senator Lee, at least, that he anticipates no further action in Venezuela now that Maduro is in U.S. custody. So maybe the United States is going to leave Venezuela in the hands of the woman who is in the line of succession right behind Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, see whether she can shore up enough support to try and remain in power, or whether the United States is going to try and sort of quietly and tacitly foment an internal uprising against the remnants of Maduro's government. I think still huge questions about that. But amid the chorus of, I think it's fair to say, concern, it's not yet condemnation from Europe, although I see Nigel Farage has conceded that the assault on Venezuela was illegal, even though he appears to be expressing the hope that better days lie ahead for Venezuela. I think that the administration here is preparing to argue that actually it had some legality, because they are going to say this was not an act of war. This was an effort to bring a wanted criminal in the United States to justice. And we also know that earlier, in the middle of last year now, in July of 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio articulated the opinion that Nicolas Maduro was not the legitimate sovereign president of Venezuela, because he had been elected as the result of an election filled with irregularities, and that the United States did not recognize him as president of Venezuela. So I think they are constructing an argument down at Mar-a-Lago that is aimed at pushing back on the notion that this was an illegal act under international law. There will be many countries around the world, friends of Venezuela and other countries in the global south, that argue that claim is too cute by half, and that this was a flagrant violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, and indicates yet again on the part of President Trump a willingness to act first and try to evade questions later. But it does indicate that amid tremendous pushback from Democrats on Capitol Hill and concern among Republicans about how the White House is going to justify all of this legally, they are constructing a narrative that will say, we were just going in to arrest President Maduro. There is one other tantalizing question, Andrew, hanging over the events of the last few hours, and that is the fact that opposition sources have told Sky News that they believe that this was a negotiated exit by the Venezuelan president. In other words, that he wasn't putting up a fight, that there'd been a conversation and a discussion about how the events of the last few hours were going to go down. And one curiosity, and I thought it was odd when I read it on the president's schedule on Thursday night, is why the Chinese ambassador to the United States was paying a visit to President Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And we also know that there has, because that doesn't usually happen, and that suddenly appeared on the president's Friday schedule. We also know that there has been a Chinese special envoy at work in Caracas who was supposed to be holding a meeting with President Maduro only yesterday. And I think one of the more tantalizing questions surrounding what we've witnessed over the last several hours is was this a negotiated exit by Maduro? And if it was, who negotiated it? And is there any coincidence between these claims of a negotiated exit and the presence of a Chinese special envoy in Caracas and the sudden arrival of the Chinese ambassador to the United States at Mar-a-Lago? Might all be speculative, and we may hear from President Trump a completely different telling of the story, but there is certainly interest in Washington in whether the United States had assistance from any other country, and obviously it would be remarkable if they had assistance from China, in negotiating effectively the surrender of Nicolas Maduro to fight these charges that he is going to face in New York. And there's no question, I think, that prosecutors will be seeking a life sentence against him and his wife, the former First Lady of Venezuela, Venezuela's Celia Flores, although both will doubtless argue that the courts in New York have no jurisdiction to be hearing the case. So Lots more questions still than answers. But I do think we are beginning to get a sense of what the president is likely to say when he addresses the American people at 4 o'clock UK time. And it will be very interesting to hear whether he indicates that this is kind of one and done and that there's not going to be any further military action immediately against Venezuela, presumably, while Washington waits to see what kind of government is able if the current government is able to maintain control under Vice President, now I suppose we must call her the presumed president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez.
Very interesting. I understand Donald Trump is speaking to Fox News now and has said that no US troops were killed in the course of the operation. We've also heard a little bit from J.D. Vance, who's talked about Donald Trump having offered Nicolas Maduro a number of off-ramps, which he'd refused to take. So we're piecing together all the different bits and pieces that might make up the case that Donald Trump's going to make in a couple of hours.
Well, that is true about President Trump offering Nicolas Maduro off-ramps, because the two men, Maduro and Trump, spoke on at least 2 occasions within the last month, and I think quite possibly more than that. And there were conversations underway at one point about the United States trying to persuade Nicolas Maduro to let American oil companies back into Venezuela. I mean, I think it wasn't a given a month ago that the American president was going to seek the ouster and the arrest of President Maduro. But certainly President Trump indicated within the last 3 weeks that he didn't know whether and he said this publicly, that he didn't know whether he could trust Nicolas Maduro, that deals had been done between the United States and Venezuela, indeed between his own government and Venezuela previously, that the Venezuelans then, according to the president, broke. And we did see early in President Trump's tenure an agreement between the government in Caracas and the government in Washington, D.C. that succeeded in bringing some American prisoners who were held in Venezuela back to Washington. And that was the beginning of the sense that there might be an opening for a warming in the bilateral relationship between Washington, D.C. and Caracas. Then everything went off the rails over the last several months. And I think that in those negotiations, as President Trump himself said, he was not sure whether he could trust the Venezuelan leader, and clearly he decided that he could not trust the Venezuelan leader, which is why he launched this absolutely bold and very aggressive move and very risky move. You know, flying American helicopters into Venezuela to pick up Nicolas Maduro, even if this was a negotiated exit, in and of itself is putting American troops at risk, and the president, I think, is going to have to address that question. We are, of course, also interested to know who exactly went in to make the arrest. Was it members of the law enforcement community? Was it the Drugs Enforcement Agency, for example? Was it active duty troops? How many men and women in uniform from the United States might have ended up, albeit briefly, putting their boots on Venezuelan soil? And I suppose the biggest question of all, Andrew, that remains totally unresolved is what happens next in Venezuela. What does the day after look like for the political movement that Nicolas Maduro has led, that now is inherited by his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez? She, I think, is going to struggle because the opposition will sense this is their moment to foment civil unrest, to unseat the government. And of course, there are also questions for Venezuela's neighbors. I saw Colombia moving troops to its border with Venezuela because they were worried about the possible movement of refugees across the border. Between land and sea borders, Venezuela shares borders with 15 separate countries. So this is a very big issue for those neighbouring countries that worry about the possible movement of refugees. But, until we hear, I think, the president explain his actions, we're not going to be ready completely to conclude that this is all over as far as US military involvement on the ground in Venezuela is concerned. And what happens about the economic blockade, about the efforts to chase those sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers that the president was engaging in just within the last 2 or 3 weeks? I mean, that wasn't primarily all about enforcing the arrest warrant against Maduro. It was all about trying to get control of Venezuelan oil. So where all of these conversations go, completely unknown. But Donald Trump bold as brass on only the third day of the new year.
Simon, thank you. One other line to emerge from Donald Trump's interview with Fox News that's happening right now is he said he watched the capture of Nicolas Maduro live from Florida. We're going to hear from the president in person at 4 o'clock or thereabouts. We'll bring it to you live here on LBC News.